Hey guys, it's QuickyBaby and welcome back to World of Tanks, and today's video is going to be all about buffs and nerfs coming in the next patch 9.20.1 to some of your favourite vehicles. Let's get started. First up, the Tier 8 British heavy tank, the Kunafa, is getting some serious buffs next patch. Wargaming are giving the vehicle a brand new gun, a 32 pounder, and caliber wise, that translates as a 94mm caliber gun. And when we compare this brand new 32 pounder to the previous best gun that was on the Kunafa, a 20 pounder gun, the changes are absolutely dramatic. Look at the DPM upgrade, it's gone up by pretty much 50%, and that's because not only has the rate of fire increased from 7.69 up to 9.23, but the alpha damage has increased from 230 up to 280. This is an absolutely bizarre transformation for the Kunafa, and it makes it one of the top 10 DPM heavy tanks in the game next patch, going from arguably one of the worst DPMs at tier 8. And I personally think that Wargaming have made a mistake with the rate of fire on this gun. I really don't think it's meant to be this high. I think that it was probably meant to have the previous rate of fire, and the 50 damage increase would give it a DPM of exactly 2,153, which would still be great for a tier 8 heavy. So I would personally take this value with a pinch of salt, although quite a lot of other aspects of the vehicle have got worse, and those aspects are really what made the Kunafa such a specialist. It's got worse shell velocity, it's got worse aim time, worse accuracy, and its traverse dispersion is worse as well. However, the Kunafa also has an upgraded turret, changing from having a turret similar to that of the Centurion Action 10, which was only really useful when you were using the gun depression, and even still to the left and to the right of the gun is less than 200mm of effective armor, right up to this old slug of a turret, 254mm at its worst, and with enough armor on the forehead of the tank to always be an auto ricochet against armor piercing rounds. It's only heat rounds that are really going to contest you, but as soon as you do use the gun depression of this tank, well, heat's not going through that anymore, is it? However, just like with the Super Conqueror, Wargaming are also buffing the weak point of the side of the Kunafa when you're side scraping. The kind of side of the fighting compartment here previously was 130 all along the side, an easy pen for most tanks. Now it's going to be 254 along this ridge here, which should make the Kunafa all the much better at side scraping next patch. And arguably, if the statistics stay like this for the Kunafa, it's going to be one of, if not the best tier 8 heavy tank in the game, but everything is subject to change, and I do believe Wargaming will see their mistake. Next up, its bigger brother, the tier 9 British heavy tank, the Conqueror, is also getting this 32 pounder gun added to it. And what's bizarre is if you choose to use the 32 pounder rather than the Conqueror's top 120mm main armament, sure, you have worse pen and a little bit worse aim time even though you're using a lower caliber gun, but look at the DPM upgrade. 2,847 is ludicrous for a tier 9 heavy, and I do personally believe that Wargaming are likely going to have to tune that down a little bit. However, the 120mm next patch is going to be changing for the Conqueror compared to how it is now. Wargaming are nerfing the rate of fire from 5.71 currently down to 5.31 in the next patch, and that's rather disappointing because I do feel that the Conqueror deserved to have that little bit of extra rate of fire, which was just a little bit more than the M103, but now it's going to drop below it. So what else are they doing to the Conqueror? Well, they're increasing the armor, and this is what's a little weird for me. Here's the current Conqueror model, and here's what the Conqueror is going to look like next patch. Do you notice that it's effectively got the same spacing that the Super Conqueror has on it? And really, the only armor differences between these tanks is the Conqueror has the old style turret, which is not rounded, while the Super Conqueror does have that rounded viewport / cupola on top of the vehicle. And the Super Conqueror has that spaced armor on top of the upper plate, and its turret spaced armor is 20mm, whereas on the tier 9 Conqueror it's 14mm. Still, look how the Conqueror has a much fatter mantlet over the tank, which will prevent people from being able to shoot to the left in between the spaced armor on the Super Conqueror. So arguably, is that a little bit of an advantage for the tier 9 tank? And I'm not sure if Wargaming really should have done this, because it kind of just makes the difference between the tier 9 and the tier 10 just so slim. But the benefit for the Conqueror is just like with the Super Conqueror and the Kunafa, the side of the tank is going to be enhanced so you can side scrape more effectively in it. Next up, British mediums and Centurion drivers out there will be happy that next patch the Centurion's turret is going to be better than ever, and really it's going to have about 250mm of effective armor all round. Some areas of it are going up to about 400, and this is identical to the tier 8 Swedish premium medium tank, the Stridsvagn 74 or the Premio Victoria, whatever you want to be calling it. Hats off to Wargaming for going through with their promise and not just leaving the Premio Victoria as a pure pay-to-win tank. It's, to all intents and purposes, it is just a Centurion now. The tier 9 British medium tank, the Centurion 7.1, will also be getting a similar treatment. Look how easy it was to penetrate the 7.1 in the current patch, with only 120mm of raw armor to the left and to the right of the gun. Next patch, that's going to be buffed up to 254. Well, that's a doubling. So it's going from being an easy to penetrate tank with a 260mm penetration gun to you having 50% chance or less, and that's probably going to get even worse for your enemies if you're using your gun depression. And so that means you've got more reason than ever next patch to go hull down in your British medium tanks and dominate those ridge lines. Wargaming are continuing to buff the tier 8 British premium medium tank. I think that just shows how terrible it was when it went into the game as that reward vehicle. But this is quite a substantial buff to the tank. The power to weight ratio is going up to 15.63. That's really nice when you take a look at the ground resistances of this tank. It's hard to believe that back in the day, when this tank first went in, it had 30 km/h top speed limit. The FV4005 should actually be much, much better. And when you combine this with a turret armor buff on this vehicle, and take a look what they're doing to the turret. Look how green it is in the current patch against its equal gun with 226mm of pen. You're always going through whenever you fight the FV4005, and the only chance it had is when it was using its gun depression if you missed and you hit its forehead. Next patch, pretty much every single plate on the tank is going to be doubled. For example, the forehead's going from 60 up to 95 to the left and the right of the gun, 165 next patch, whereas currently it's 85, and immediately to the left and the right of the gun it was 115, now it's going to be 240, and so that means that against lower tier tanks they're no longer going to go through your turret constantly. Against equal tier tanks they're less than a 50-50 to go through, and look what happens when you use the gun depression of this tank. You are going to be bouncing all equal tiered tanks unless they're firing premium rounds at you, and lower tiered vehicles have absolutely no chance to be penetrating this thing in the turret even with premium rounds. And so more reason than ever to get out your FV4005, just don't expect it to kill anything quickly. Next up, there's a whole series of buffs to British turreted tank destroyers. Let's take a look first at the Challenger, a tier 7 British tank destroyer that a lot of people loathe. However, personally for me, I've always looked at it as a comet that doesn't quite need to fire so many premium rounds. So Wargaming are going to be giving the Challenger the 32-pounder a lot like it is on the Kunafa. And while the DPM of this tank will drop by about 150, look at the penetration upgrade, 220, that's fantastic for a tier 7 tank. And if you elect to fire premium rounds, it's 252. That's going to be more than enough to butcher anything that sits in front of you. The alpha damage as well has nearly doubled up to 280. And at tier 7, that's pretty good. It's not a disaster like the 150 was, which required you to be constantly sitting in front of your opponents and just shooting at them and hoping that they were going to miss you. Now you might be able to pop over a ridge, snap a shot in, and pull back, a lot like you would do on something like a Jagdpanther or a T25 AT, although those vehicles with their 105mm caliber guns do get 320 alpha. Unfortunately, if you want to use the bigger caliber gun, you're going to have worse aim time and worse accuracy than you would do with the 17-pounder, but I'm sure this is a trade that a lot of you will make. Now onto one of my favorite shoot and scoot vehicles in the game. It is the tier 8 British Charioteer, and yeah, its depression is going to be doubled from 5 degrees to 10 degrees, which will dramatically enhance the locations that the Charioteer can use and reduce the amount that you have to expose this fairly god-awful turret. Furthermore, its bigger brother, the tier 9 British turreted tank destroyer, the Conway, is getting some buffs as well. Its gun depression is also being doubled up to 10, will make it much better on a ridgeline. And take a look at the top speed, up to 50 km/h, and this vehicle has a very nice power to weight ratio. It will be able to get up to that 50, which means that while previously the Conway with its 35 km/h top speed limit really had to just go into a position and then just shoot its way out of trouble when it got there, now it's going to be able to fall back. And also it gets a tiny little turret reverse increase up to 18 degrees, but every little helps, right? But the main difference with the Conway is that there's a whole new gun to choose. No longer will you only be able to pick 120mm with 400 alpha damage, which isn't great for tier 9. There is a B TL 5.5-inch gun, which is just shy of 140mm in caliber. And this gun, like its bigger brother the FV4005, will have different flavors of ammunition, including premium HESH rounds. Now, the standard alpha damage of your armor-piercing rounds is 600. That's a really nice round, and a 50% upgrade over if you choose to use the 120mm on this tank. But if you load HESH, it's 770, although your penetration drops from 260 down to 200. Now, these rounds are very expensive. We are talking about 7,200 a shot. That is absolutely horrific. And the damage increase from 600 to 770, it's not really sufficient to, at least in my opinion, justify the 6 times cost. Although I bet you there are still going to be people out there who just dab that 2 key, load the gold, and spam these HESH rounds at you, and it's going to be probably quite annoying to have more HESH rounds in the game, I'd say. But at least the damage increase is conservative. 770 from 600 is not nearly the same as, for example, on its tier 10 brother, where it's 1,750 from 1,150. Now, if you choose to use this gun, you will be sacrificing some of the monster DPM that the Conway has. You're also going to gain 0.5 seconds aim time, you're going to lose some accuracy and some turret traverse dispersion. And personally for me, I still think that the 120mm caliber gun is going to be superior on the Conway. But for those of you who absolutely love alpha damage or just want to load the gold and spam HESH at your opponents, then that 140mm caliber gun should make the tank a lot more entertaining. And now, ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, I want to show you one of the most crazy buffs of all time. And that is to the FV4005, that tier 10 British turreted tank destroyer. And everybody thinks of it as just a bad FV215B183, and it's probably one of the least competitive tier 10 tanks in the game. Well, it looks like Wargaming are finally going to do something about that. Number 1. Ammo increase. One of the limiting factors of the FV215B183 was that you just couldn't carry enough rounds to be able to kill the entirety of the enemy team. 20 rounds should really help the FV4005 and also allow you to carry a larger supply of both armor piercing and those filthy premium HESH rounds, and so you don't have to fire HESH at the end of the game when maybe armor piercing would suffice and you get to save some credits. Next up, the turret traverse is being buffed from 0.34, that's got to be one of the worst turret traverses I've ever seen in World of Tanks, down to 0.3. That's still terrible, but it is a significant increase. Now, a dramatic change here. 5 degrees extra gun depression. 10 degrees will allow this thing to work ridge lines. And that makes the FV4005 oh so dangerous and not have to expose its god-awful turret, because this has to be the worst turret in the game. It's gigantic and 14mm thick, but just take a look at it now when it's using 10 degrees of its depression. That makes it oh so much more of a small target to hit, whereas previously it would have to expose a much larger part of its forehead, as we can see here with its 5 degrees. Next up, the gun traverse limit is also being doubled on this tank. Previously, the vehicle could only turn 45 degrees to the right and 45 degrees to the left. Now the vehicle is going to be able to turn 90 degrees to the left and 90 degrees to the right, which means that it's going to be able to drive sideways and just broadside you. This, combined with that gun depression buff, is just going to make the vehicle oh so much more flexible, and don't think you can track the FV4005 anymore and just get alongside it, because I think it's going to have something to say about it. Next up, as if that wasn't enough, the mobility of the vehicle, just like on the Conway, is being increased from 35 up to 50. That's going to make this kind of more like a medium tank. But this is the crazy thing, at least in my opinion, and I think where Wargaming might be taking this tank a little bit too far. And I'm not talking about the reverse speed. That's very welcome as well. 15 kilometers an hour backwards, that's much better than 12. But take a look at the power to weight ratio. The engine power is going from 650 up to 950 without changing the vehicle's ground resistances. That means this thing has got an 18.62 power to weight ratio, which allows it to scoot around more like a medium tank. And when you combine this with a turret traverse increase from 12 to 16, that's a third better. The FV4005 looks like it is a tank that is going to be going from 0 to possibly hero. And finally, for the Brits, the Centurion Action 10 is also getting some improved turret armor, a lot like on the FV4202 previously. The whole of the top of the tank was 85mm raw, and that gave it very poor effective armor unless it was using its gun depression. Next up, it's going to be 111.1. That is rather decent, so that means that even if you aren't using the gun depression of the tank, you're still going to have 260mm of turret armor until your opponents get above you. And when you go hull down in this tank, that means that even heat rounds are going to struggle to get through the top of your tank with 475mm of effective armor. Next up, there are substantial buffs to the left and to the right of the gun, 254 and 254 below the gun as well. Previously, it was awful, 198 to the left, to the right, and underneath. So we're going from a 100% chance to penetrate the Centurion Action 10 down to about a 60% chance, again, if the vehicle isn't using its depression. Next up, let's talk about the Rheinmetall Panzerwagen, the tier 10 German light tank. It's being changed. I'm not going to say it's just a flat-out buff, even though I feel that the vehicle probably needed it. And so what's happening? Well, here's the Rheinmetall Panzerwagen in the current patch and on the right in the next patch. So its DPM is going down a little bit, and its alpha damage is going from 360 to 320, but at least its rate of fire is increasing by 2/3 of a round a minute. Personally, I think that they probably could have left the alpha damage at 360. I don't really see the need to reduce it to 320, and I hope this is a change that Wargaming reconsider. I don't see why you would need to reduce the alpha down to 320 for this tank unless you make the rate of fire even higher, maybe 7, maybe 8. Let's not forget that tier 10 medium tanks have about 9 rounds a minute rate of fire at tier 10 if they've got 320 alpha, and so why do your tier 10 light tanks still have to have such mediocre DPM is beyond me. The vehicle's getting an increased ammo capacity of 5 rounds, and that's very needed, but when you also combine that with the lower alpha damage, it doesn't really make much difference in the potential. One thing that is fantastic, though, that they're doing to the Rheinmetall Panzerwagen is the aim time. It's going from 1.9 to 1.6, and look at the dispersion buffs as well. 0.18 when moving to 0.14, and 0.12 to 0.1 when turning the turret. That means that this tank is just barely going to have to aim, and it also might be an argument that you drop vertical stabilizers on this tank to be able to take vents in conjunction with your coated optics and also your gun rammer. And so all in all, I think this is a buff for the Rheinmetall Panzerwagen. I'm just not sure if it's quite large enough. Next up, let's take a look to see what is happening to Chinese vehicles, and the dispersion on the Type 59 is being decreased by 22 when moving and also 25% when turning the turret, and its aim time is being buffed from 2.9 seconds to 2.3. This should add relevancy again to the Type 59, a vehicle that has just been power creep, frankly. But I don't think this addresses the main problem with the Type 59, and that is that vehicles with preferential matchmaking are just not competitive anymore. Wargaming need to do something for all of the preferential matchmaking tanks, because the amount of tier 9s they see just far outweighs the amount of tier 6s that they see, and they're underpowered. They're balanced around tier 7.5, but they're not getting matched up like tier 7.5 tanks anymore. Next up, another tier 8 Chinese premium medium tank, the T-34 III, is having its aim time buff from 3.4 down to 2.9, and Wargaming ambiguously have said here they're just increasing the armor of the hull and the turret. But what this actually is a 10mm buff to the front part of the tank, a 30mm buff to the side. That means that this vehicle can now side scrape against the very large caliber guns like the BL-10, for example, and its turret armor is 10mm thicker at the front and 10mm thicker at the side, and I know these statistics. It's a complete copy of the Type 59 here. We can see the difference between the next patch is going to be absolutely negligible. And so that's all in all a great buff for the T-34 III. Also, the 59 pattern is going to be slightly cheaper to play as its penetration is increased from 190 up to 212. And a bizarre change to the WZ-1321, its ammo rack capacity has been increased from 36 up to 40. Well, I guess that was one of the more competitive tier 10 light tanks, but I still think that it needs just a little bit more love. Talking about tier 10 light tanks, the T100LT is also getting a little bit of love next patch. Its rate of fire is increasing from 7.14 up to 7.69, but when we also consider that this vehicle has 300 alpha damage, it's a welcome DPM increase, but it's not a crazy one. I'd still personally rather sit in a tier 9 medium tank and simply dab that 2 key, but all in all, a nice little buff to arguably the best scout tank in the game. Next up, America, and changes to the M551 Sheridan if you choose to use the 105mm on it. Wow, Wargaming are basically completely going back on their late last-minute alpha damage changes from the test server when the light tanks came out. 360 back up to 390, and no mention of a rate of fire nerf? wow, one of the best DPM light tanks is now going to be even better. And I think this is a little bizarre change because Wargaming are just buffing the Sheridan to be way out in front of all of the other DPMs of the tier 10 light tanks. Now, I'm not saying that they all need to be the same, but it's just bizarre to me that they would choose to buff the Sheridan so much, but yet increase the rate of fire of the Rheinmetall, but reduce its alpha damage, and just ignore the WZ1321, whose specialty was that lovely alpha damage and the turret armor. Nevertheless, next patch will be a great time to dust off your Sheridan, but I still think that it's not exactly going to be competing with most of the tier 10 medium tanks on every single map it plays on. Next up, the M41 Walker Bulldog, and this is kind of irrelevant news. Wargaming are just removing the autoloader from it, but that autoloader has not been competitive for the longest of times. Next up, news for the M41 Walker Bulldog. They are removing the autoloader, but let's be honest, they pretty much removed it when they changed the light tanks matchmaking. When they gave it that god-awful rate of fire, they effectively killed the gun, and the cynical members of you out there will say that they nerfed it so much as kind of an interperiod to just straight out removing it. And so, clever moves, Wargaming. I see that you're trying to limit the PR outrage, right? And if it wasn't for the fact that the T71 was everything that the Walker Bulldog was at tier 7, and arguably more, at least, well, not quite as when it went in its first unnerved state, but even I agree it was too much then. I'd probably be a little bit more annoyed about this, but the T71 is in such a good position that the Walker Bulldog is irrelevant. Next up, random changes to French artillery. It's having its weight decrease, that's the tier 9 batch Centurion 15555, and to compensate it's having its engine power of its horsepower reduced, and it's also having decreased armor on the hull and the turret. Easier to penetrate was already pretty easy. And finally, the tier 10 French light tank, the AMX 13105, is having its alpha damage increased from 360 to 390. Now that is actually really big news because remember, it's an autoloader. So not only is this a DPM increase as Wargaming are not changing the reload time of the tank, but it's a magazine increase, and that is the key. They're not increasing the delay between the shots, so this alpha damage increase means more burst fire and more magazine potential. Now this vehicle is going to be doing 1,170 damage within 5 seconds of the first shot, and that is significant. And once again, a nice little buff to a tier 10 light tank, a class that I feel that Wargaming butchered right at the end of their development cycle. But I still think that the buffs to the tier 10 light tanks are arguably not quite enough. A lot of them either have poor view range or just absolutely tragic DPM. And it seems like they're taking baby steps with the tier 10 light tanks, but just did absolutely massive dramatic things all at the same time to something like an FV4005 Stage 2. I think this tank is going to be absolutely crazy next patch, and it just seems so bizarre to me that they would make such massive changes all at the same time to the FV40 Stage 2, but kind of just make baby steps with an entire class of tier 10 tanks that has needed much love for months. Anyway, that about covers it. I hope you enjoyed this video, and maybe it was useful for you, that I hopefully demystified a little bit of the mumbo jumbo. If it was, consider giving the video a thumbs up. I'd really appreciate it. And there's a lot to talk about in the comments. I especially want to know what you think about to the tier 10 light tank changes, and also the FV4005 Stage 2, which I think if we don't address kind of is going to be the elephant in the room. And also finally, I'd like to clarify that everything in here is subject to change. Remember, this is a test server. My predictions is that Wargaming are going to maybe tone down the FV4005 Stage 2 a little bit. They're going to nerf the rate of fire of the 32 pounder on the Kunafa, and hopefully before release they'll just give a little bit more love to some of the tier 10 lights. And as always, thank you so much for watching. You've been epic, and hopefully I'll see you soon.